Welcome to Boring Pastimes, where history drifts quietly into your evening. No battles, no drama, only the soft rustle of forgotten pages and the steady hush of time. Tonight, we wander slowly through the quiet corners of the past, so you can rest, relax, and perhaps even fall asleep among the dust of old stories. Story 1. The Stables of Windsor. Queen Elizabeth II and her lifelong love of horses. When you picture Queen Elizabeth II, your mind may wander first to her image on coins or postage stamps, to the brightly colored hats she wore at public events, or perhaps to the solemn wave she perfected across decades of monarchy. Yet, if you were to ask her, in one of those rare, unguarded moments, what she truly loved, what activity brought her calm away from affairs of state, the answer would have been simple: horses. For Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, horses were not an accessory of royal display, but a constant thread through the fabric of her life. From the very first pony she rode as a child, to the breeding and racing of thoroughbreds that carried her name well into her 90s, horses were both pastime and anchor. To understand her quiet pastimes, you must begin not with jewels or ceremonies, but with hay, straw, and the rhythmic sound of hooves echoing through the stables of Windsor. In the 1920s and 1930s, when Elizabeth was a child, Britain was still deeply shaped by equestrian culture. Automobiles were increasing, of course, but the countryside still bore the memory of horses pulling carts, carrying soldiers, and pacing in paddocks. For a little princess growing up in Windsor, horses were not only part of royal tradition, but also part of the rhythm of childhood. Her first pony, a Shetland named Peggy, was a gift from her grandfather, King George V. Peggy was small, sturdy, and manageable, the sort of pony that demanded both respect and gentleness from the young rider perched upon her back. Elizabeth was 6 years old. Imagine her at that age, small in stature, carefully helped into the saddle by a stable hand, the smell of leather reins mingling with the grassy scent of the paddock. There is something undeniably steadying about a horse's breath, the way the animal's body radiates warmth even on a cool morning. For Elizabeth, those early rides became lessons in discipline. Ponies are not always compliant, and a child must learn not to pull too harshly, nor to sit too loosely, but to balance between firmness and trust. It is a detail easy to overlook when you consider the vast machinery of monarchy. But riding taught her skills that would serve her entire reign: patience, posture, and the ability to remain calm when others might panic. Horses startle at sudden noises. Crowds, too, can shift and surge with little warning. Learning how to steady a pony at 6 years old was, in its way, a quiet rehearsal for steadying a nation at 25. The stables of Windsor became her sanctuary. They were not gilded rooms, nor places of state business, but spaces of order and routine. Grooms rose early, sweeping straw, filling water buckets, brushing coats until they shone. Tack was polished, hooves checked, feed measured carefully. Elizabeth absorbed these details not as chores, but as rituals. A horse cannot thrive without attention to the small things, and a monarch, she would later learn, cannot govern without attention to them either. By her teenage years, Elizabeth was not only riding, but also beginning to study the art of breeding and training. Horses, like people, come with temperaments. Some are spirited, some are cautious, some bold, to the point of recklessness. She learned to notice gait, to observe ears and eyes, to sense when a horse was nervous or when it was at ease. These observations demanded patience, the kind of watchfulness that does not call attention to itself but rewards. The one who persists. During the Second World War, when the palace itself was darkened and rationing shaped daily meals, Elizabeth found in horses a continuity that survived even amid sirens and blackouts. While her duties as a young auxiliary officer in the ATS kept her busy, she still made time to ride. A horse does not care if bombs fall far off in London. It still needs to be fed, brushed, exercised. That simple necessity tethered her to a rhythm that war could not fully disrupt. And yet, horses were not only private comfort, they became public symbol. From her early years as princess to her later role as queen, Elizabeth was often photographed on horseback, whether reviewing troops or riding in ceremonies. Unlike jewels, which she wore because tradition demanded them, horses were something she chose. The difference is quiet but telling. A brooch can be pinned on by a lady. A horse must be approached, mounted, and guided. When she ascended the throne in 1952, she was just 25 years old, a young woman suddenly bearing the weight of an empire. Among the upheavals, ministers, speeches, oaths, and mourning for her father, the stables remained unchanged. Horses still nickered when approached, still leaned their heads for a rub, still needed grooming before a ride. In those moments, the monarch could be simply Elizabeth, rider and caretaker, finding steadiness in something older than crowns. There is something almost paradoxical in it, symbol of continuity, finding her own continuity in creatures that lived scarcely more than a few decades. Horses came and went. Some became champions, others stayed as companions. Each one carried her, each one reminded her of beginnings in Windsor Fields. You might ask yourself, what is it about horses that could hold such power over a life already filled with pageantry? Why would a woman who met heads of state, signed treaties, and reigned over realms still find deepest satisfaction in the quiet rhythm of hooves on grass? Perhaps it is because horses demand attention to the present. You cannot think of tomorrow's speech or yesterday's council meeting while guiding a horse along a path. Your body must balance, your hands must adjust, your eyes must notice the ground ahead. For Elizabeth, whose mind was always pulled between past traditions and future responsibilities, the horse anchored her in the now. And so, through her childhood pony, Peggy, through the wartime rides, and through the stables of Windsor, horses became more than pastime. They became a philosophy of steady composure, of patience, of presence. But if the early rides gave her balance, what of the more competitive world she later entered, the breeding and racing of thoroughbreds? Did her private passion remain a private joy, or did it transform into something larger, something tied to national identity and even global reputation? If the childhood pony, Peggy, taught Elizabeth patience, and wartime rides kept her steady, then the next stage of her life with horses expanded the relationship into something both private and public. The world of thoroughbred breeding and racing. Here, the monarch's pastime overlapped with national tradition, industry, and spectacle. Horses ceased to be simply companions in the stable. They became symbols, investments, and, at times, national icons. For most of her reign, Elizabeth was not only a rider, but a breeder and owner of some of the finest racehorses in Britain. This may seem like an aristocratic indulgence, yet for her it was something much quieter: the daily, disciplined study of bloodlines, traits, and performance. Just as her ancestors traced genealogies of people, she traced genealogies of horses. Which sire produced stamina, which dam produced a strong shoulder or a willing temperament. Each pairing was a decision, and each foal born at the royal studs carried the possibility of triumph or disappointment. Her involvement in racing began not long after she ascended the throne in 1952. That year, one of her horses, Oriole, nearly won the Derby at Epsom, coming in second. It was a reminder that success in racing is never guaranteed, no matter one's station in life. The horse that runs may have noble bloodlines and the finest training, yet the difference between first and second is often a matter of inches, a split-second hesitation, or an unexpected shift of wind. Elizabeth learned quickly that racing was both art and uncertainty. Much like governance itself, the royal studs at Sandringham and other estates became places of careful observation. Grooms and trainers reported details daily: feed intake, behavior in the paddock, the condition of a coat, the measure of stride. Elizabeth did not treat these reports as mere ceremony. She read them with genuine attention, marking notes, asking questions, remembering patterns. When a foal was born, she often visited herself, inspecting conformation, running a practiced eye over shoulders, legs, and stance. Breeding was not glamorous work. It required record-keeping, patience, and acceptance of frequent failure. For every promising yearling, there were others who never showed speed. For every race won, there were many lost. Elizabeth understood this rhythm, and, unlike some owners who chased quick victories, she remained steady across decades. Horses taught consistency, and she applied that lesson to her stables as much as to her reign. One of the most famous of her horses was Dutel, a chestnut colt who won several significant races in the 1950s. Another, Heikler, won the 1,000 guineas in 1974 and then triumphed in France's prestigious Prix de Diane. Perhaps most notably, her filly Estimate won the Ascot Gold Cup in 2013, a victory that brought not only prestige but visible joy. Photographs of the Queen at Ascot that day, smiling broadly, seemed to capture a rare moment when her inner life met the public stage. But behind each victory were long stretches of ordinary labor. Stable hands rose before dawn. Trainers trotted horses along tracks in all weather. Veterinarians checked hooves and teeth. Feed was measured not by the Queen herself, but by her trusted staff. Yet she knew enough to understand the importance of each detail. Grain too rich might cause colic. Too much exercise might wear down joints. The art of racing was in balance, and she respected those who practiced it. This quiet attention made her well regarded within the racing community. Jockeys, trainers, and breeders spoke of her knowledge with genuine respect. They did not see a distant monarch issuing commands, but a fellow devotee who understood the subtleties of the craft. To attend a conversation with her about horses was, they said, to encounter someone who remembered bloodlines from memory and asked practical questions rather than ceremonial ones. Racing also bound her to the public. Each year, the sight of her arriving in a carriage, then watching intently from the stands, was a ritual repeated across decades. For many, it was the most human glimpse of their monarch, not at a state banquet or official ceremony, but at the edge of a racetrack, binoculars raised, eyes fixed on a thundering field of horses. And yet, despite the visibility, the pastime retained its quieter dimension. Behind the excitement of race day were ledgers, breeding charts, and years of planning. Victories may have been celebrated in the newspapers, but in the Queen's private life, the work was measured in foals born, bloodlines improved, and quiet satisfaction when a careful pairing produced promise. It is easy to forget how much money and employment circled around the royal studs. Breeding horses was not only a pastime, but also an industry. Blacksmiths, stable hands, trainers, veterinarians, transport drivers, all earned their living, in part, through the Queen's dedication. Her personal hobby thus rippled outward, sustaining jobs and traditions across Britain. In this sense, her pastime was also a form of stewardship. By investing in horses, she kept alive a network of rural crafts and practices that might otherwise have faded. Still, breeding and racing were never without disappointment. Horses fell lame. Promising 2-year-olds sometimes never fulfilled their potential. A muddy track, an awkward start, or a small injury could undo years of preparation. Elizabeth, by all accounts, accepted these disappointments with composure. Success and failure alike were absorbed into the rhythm of the stables. Yet one cannot ignore the symbolic weight racing carried for her. For centuries, monarchs had been associated with horses, from cavalry charges to coronation processions. By devoting herself not to war horses, but to race horses, Elizabeth reshaped that tradition in a gentler form. She was not a monarch leading armies, but one presiding over paddocks. In that sense, her equestrian passion was both modern and deeply traditional. A continuation of heritage translated into peacetime ritual. If horses in her childhood gave her calm, and horses in her early reign offered her steadiness, then horses in the world of racing gave her a bridge between private joy and public identity. The cheers at Ascot, the reports in newspapers, the smiles captured in photographs, all hinted at something deeper. For Elizabeth, each horse carried not only her hopes, but also a piece of the monarchy's connection to the ordinary rhythms of British life. And yet, one may still wonder, beyond the public spectacle and private ledgers, what did the horses mean to her personally as she aged? When the demands of state grew heavy, did the simple act of brushing a horse's coat or walking among the stables provide a kind of refuge no council chamber could match? If the first half of Queen Elizabeth II's life with horses was about learning, breeding, and racing, the later decades revealed the fullest measure of what they meant to her. Horses became less about competition, less about trophies or breeding charts, and more about companionship, memory, and continuity. In her 90s, she was still riding slowly, carefully, but with unmistakable ease, as if to remind both herself and others that her life's rhythm remained tied to the steady sound of hooves. The world had changed around her in profound ways. Empires had receded, technology had accelerated, and even the monarchy itself was under constant scrutiny. Yet the horses remained. They did not care for headlines or political debates. They greeted her with the same soft nicker when she arrived at these. They leaned their warm bodies against her hand, searching for a pat or a cube of sugar. In a life where nearly every moment was observed, horses gave her the gift of being un-ov esper at Windsor. The stables were kept in immaculate condition, but not overly polished for show. Buckets clanged, straw rustled, and the steady hum of work filled the air. Grooms moved with quiet efficiency. Horses shifted their weight, snorted, and flicked their tails. For Elizabeth, this was not a backdrop, but a sanctuary. She did not need to perform here. She needed only to be present, even as her role grew more symbolic and ceremonial with age. Horses gave her something practical to do. She could inspect a foal, adjust a bridle, or simply walk along a line of stalls. Unlike the affairs of government, often filled with abstract issues, reports, and speeches, the tasks in the stable were tangible. A horse was either well-groomed or not. A saddle was either adjusted correctly or askew. These small certainties provided comfort in a life filled with uncertainty. Her rides in later years were shorter, and sometimes she rode ponies rather than full-sized horses, both for safety and for ease. Yet even these brief outings carried immense meaning. To ride is to feel the earth move beneath you, to be part of a rhythm older than cars, planes, or computers. For Elizabeth, each ride was a reminder of her childhood, of wartime steadiness, of Ascot victories. Horses contained her past as much as they carried her in the present. She also remained deeply invested in her horse's welfare. Even when she could no longer ride as vigorously, she continued to visit the studs and stables, to ask after bloodlines, to follow reports. Staff members recalled her sharp memory for details. She could name the sire and dam of a foal born years earlier, or recall the specific conditions of a race decades past. In this way, horses were not simply animals she loved, but also threads in the fabric of her memory. The public often caught glimpses of this passion in moments that seemed minor compared to state occasions. Photographs of her, dressed in a headscarf and boots, smiling beside a horse, conveyed more about her true self than portraits in crown and robes. At Windsor or Balmoral, leading a horse by the reins, she appeared not as sovereign but as caretaker. There is also a deeper symbolism here. Horses are creatures of both strength and fragility. They can carry great weight, run at great speed, yet they are vulnerable to injury and dependent on human care. In many ways, Elizabeth's relationship with horses mirrored her relationship with the monarchy itself. Powerful, enduring, yet requiring constant stewardship and attention to detail. Neglect could be costly. Patience and consistency brought reward. In the last decade of her life, when health limited her more than she once admitted, horses continued to appear as steady companions. Family members spoke of her delight when visiting foals were brought close enough for her to see them. The joy was not diminished by age. If anything, it deepened, for in those quiet encounters she was revisiting every decade of her past. When her horse Estimate won the Ascot Gold Cup in 2013, she was 87 years old. The victory was historic, not only because it was the first time a reigning monarch had won the race, but because of what it symbolized, that even in her late years, her passion was alive, her eye for breeding still sharp. The image of her smiling widely that day was broadcast across the world. For once, the carefully composed public face gave way to visible delight. The horse had won, and for Elizabeth, It was as if a lifetime of patience had ripened into joy. But not every story is one of triumph. Horses age, as people do. She had to say farewell to many, and each loss was felt. Yet she approached these moments with the same composure she applied to her public duties. A horse's life, though shorter than hers, was valued, remembered, and honored. The cycle of birth and death in the stables was a reminder of continuity, of time's passage, of the humility all living beings share. Horses also provided her with continuity across generations. She introduced her children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren to riding. It was not only a pastime, but an inheritance. Through horses, she passed down patience, steadiness, and respect for tradition. In family photographs, young royals on ponies echoed her own childhood images, creating a sense of unbroken line, not just of monarchy, but of horsemanship. In her final years, when she was less visible in public life, the reports that she still took interest in her horses offered comfort to many. It suggested that even as her reign neared its close, her inner world remained anchored by the same quiet pastimes that had begun when she was 6 years old with Peggy the pony. When she passed in 2022, tributes flowed not only from heads of state and politicians, but also from jockeys, trainers, and breeders. They spoke of her as one of their own, someone who truly loved and understood horses. That alone set her apart. Monarchs may be remembered for policies or ceremonies, but Elizabeth was also remembered in stables, in paddocks, and at racetracks. What can one make of this lifelong devotion? Was it simply an aristocratic hobby carried through a long life? Or was it something deeper? Perhaps it was both. Horses gave her privacy in a life without it. They gave her grounding in a role defined by symbolism. They gave her joy in victories and patience in setbacks. They gave her a language of continuity that outlasted empires and political storms. When you think of Queen Elizabeth II, you may think of her wave, her voice, her face on currency. But when she thought of herself, perhaps she remembered most vividly the feel of reins in her hands, the warmth of a horse's breath on her cheek, the rhythm of hooves carrying her steadily forward. And so we might ask, if horses were her anchor, then what does it tell us about the human need for anchors of our own? In a world of change and duty, what quiet pastimes do we hold close, and which companions, human or animal, carry us through the long passage of years? Story 2. The ritual of the royal handbagged horses were Queen Elizabeth II's lifelong companions outdoors, then indoors, and in public life there was another object, always close at hand, the handbag, small, structured, and often understated. Her handbag became as much a part of her image as her hats, pearls, and steady wave. For most people, a handbag is a practical item meant to carry essentials. For Elizabeth, it was that and something more, a tool of communication, a shield of privacy, and a quiet ritual woven into the fabric of daily duty. From the earliest years of her reign, observers noted that she rarely appeared in public without it. At state dinners, garden parties, visits abroad, and even simple church services, the handbag was always present, looped over her forearm. The styles varied slightly over the decades, but not dramatically. She preferred structured shapes, usually in black or neutral colors. Produced by Launer of London, a brand she favored for its durability and discreet elegance. The handbag was not about fashion statements. It was about continuity. Why, one might ask, did a monarch need a handbag at all? After all, she was always accompanied by attendants, secretaries, and security officers. Anything she might need, documents, telephones, keys, could easily have been carried for her. Yet the queen insisted. The handbag was hers to carry, hers to place on a chair, hers to rest in her lap. In a life where so much was managed by others, the handbag was something she controlled herself. Inside, by most accounts, the contents were modest. Reading glasses, perhaps a compact mirror, a lipstick for quick touch-ups, a small mint or sweet, sometimes a handkerchief. On Sundays, she often tucked in a folded bill for church collection. Rarely did she carry anything heavy, though occasionally she included a pen or a diary note. There was nothing extraordinary in these objects, nothing a secretary could not have handled. But that was not the point. The point was the small act of independence, the sense that she, too, like anyone else, needed a place to keep her personal items. The handbag also served as a signal, a quiet code known to her staff. If she shifted the bag from one hand to another, or placed it on the table, it could mean she wished to move on from a conversation. If she set it firmly on the floor, it might be a stronger sign that she wanted to end the engagement altogether. In this way, the handbag became a discreet instrument of diplomacy, allowing her to guide the flow of events without words. Few ever noticed the signals. Those who did worked within the system. To the public, it was simply a handbag. To those near her, it was a language. There is something almost poetic in the contrast. Here was a woman at the center of the 20th and 21st centuries, carrying constitutional power and the weight of history. And yet, she managed parts of her daily life through the tilt of a handbag. The grand machinery of monarchy turned in palaces and parliaments. But at its heart were these quiet gestures, so ordinary they might have gone unnoticed. The choice of handbag itself became a ritual. She did not rotate through dozens of styles. Instead, she remained faithful to a few designs, preferring familiarity over variety. A Lanner bag could last for decades, its leather carefully maintained, its structure unchanged. This too reflected her philosophy: stability, consistency, and a refusal to be swayed by trends. Where other royals experimented with fashion, Elizabeth's handbag remained constant, like the steady beat of her reign. When traveling abroad, the handbag traveled with her. In photographs from Australia, Canada, Kenya, or the United States, it is there, sometimes clutched firmly, sometimes resting lightly against her arm. It was both personal belonging and symbolic companion, a reminder of home, of routine, of something unchanged amid the unfamiliar. In a sense, it anchored her just as horses did, though in a different sphere. It also made her approachable. To see a monarch carrying a handbag is to be reminded that, at some level, she is a person like anyone else, who might need to reach for a lipstick or a mint. The handbag softened the image of authority. Crowns and scepters belonged to ceremonies. Handbags belonged to daily life. And it was in daily life that Elizabeth wished to be steady, even ordinary, in her own quiet way in later years. Speculation about the handbag's contents became a kind of minor fascination. Newspapers sometimes ran light-hearted articles guessing what secrets it held. comedians and cartoonists occasionally played with the image, exaggerating the bag's size or imagining unlikely items within. Yet the truth remained simple. There was nothing sensational about it. The handbag's power lay not in its contents, but in its presence. Think of it as a thread woven into every appearance. Each time she stepped out of a car, shook hands, or waved to a crowd, the handbag was there. Its absence would have been more noticeable than its presence. Like the pearls she wore so consistently, the handbag was part of her uniform, not chosen for novelty, but for reliability. But beyond the signals, the contents, and the uniformity, the handbag carried a deeper significance. It was, in its way, a symbol of privacy. A monarch lives under constant observation. Every word, every gesture, every facial expression is recorded, analyzed, debated. The handbag, however, was hers alone. No one searched it, no one carried it for her, no one dictated what she placed inside. It was the one space that was fully her own. Imagine the comfort of that. A small leather space that belonged not to the crown, not to the government, not to tradition, but to Elizabeth herself. In it, she could carry a letter, a photograph, or a folded note, unseen by all. In a life defined by visibility, the handbag offered invisibility. And so we are left with a question. If such an ordinary object could hold such quiet meaning for a monarch, what might it reveal about the balance she sought between duty and self? What does it mean that even a queen required a small, private refuge? To the untrained eye, Queen Elizabeth II's handbag was no more than a practical accessory. Yet to those who worked close to her, it was a subtle instrument of communication. In a monarchy where words are measured carefully, where a glance or pause can speak louder than a speech, the handbag became part of her silent vocabulary. Accounts from aides and courtiers revealed that the position of the handbag often conveyed the queen's intentions. If she shifted it from her left arm to her right, it was a polite signal to her staff that she wished to conclude a conversation. If she placed it on a table beside her, it suggested that she was ready to move on. If she set it firmly on the floor, it meant she needed to be extracted quickly. None of these signals were dramatic. They were discreet, almost invisible to anyone not in the know. Yet they allowed her to guide the flow of events with dignity and without awkwardness. Consider the practicality of this system. As sovereign, she was constantly meeting strangers, politicians, dignitaries, community leaders, or members of the public. These meetings had to be managed delicately. A monarch could not appear impatient or dismissive, nor could she linger indefinitely. The handbag became her ally, a non-verbal way of maintaining control while preserving grace. It is striking that she chose not to use words, nor even strong gestures, but rather the simple repositioning of a small leather bag. In that choice lay a philosophy: power exercised quietly, without spectacle. The handbag became less a fashion item and more a tool of statecraft, though a tool disguised in simplicity. Observers sometimes speculated on what this revealed about her personality. Some saw it as evidence of shrewdness, a practical system devised and refined over years. Others saw it as an extension of her preference for understatement. She never courted drama, never raised her voice in public. She allowed the handbag to do the speaking for her in its quiet way. The symbolism extended further. In photographs of her across the decades, the handbag is always present, resting against the curve of her arm. It came to signify continuity, just as she favored pearls, simple brooches, and bright hats, so too did she favor the handbag. These items became part of a uniform that reassured the public, where politicians came and went, where fashions shifted, the queen remained constant, her handbag unchanged. This constancy mattered. In times of political turmoil, economic uncertainty, or social change, the familiar image of the queen, steady, composed handbag in place, reassured many. It was as if the handbag itself carried part of the monarchy's stability. Small though it was, it became emblematic of her reign. Yet the handbag's symbolism was not limited to Britain. Abroad, too, it carried weight. When visiting other nations, she was seen with it at her side, a reminder that she traveled not as an individual, but as the embodiment of an institution. It was practical, yes, but also symbolic. She carried with her a piece of home, a fragment of British life, wherever she went. One might argue that the handbag reflected her approach to monarchy itself. Just as the bag concealed its contents from public view, so too did she conceal much of her personal life. She allowed glimpses, but never full access. She preserved mystery, and in doing so preserved authority. The handbag, closed and opaque, was a metaphor for the sovereign herself, present, familiar, but never fully revealed. This guardedness was not without its critics. Some wished she had been more open, more candid about her feelings. Yet the handbag reminds us that for Elizabeth, privacy was essential. In a world where every word she spoke could be dissected, she needed to keep something for herself. The handbag, as an object and as a symbol, defended that boundary. Over time, the public grew fond of this small constant. Children might recognize the queen by her hats or her wave, but adults often remarked on the handbag. It became the subject of affectionate jokes, of cartoons that exaggerated its size or contents. Did it contain marmalade sandwiches, as imagined in her light-hearted skit with Paddington Bear during the Platinum Jubilee? Or was it, as some humorists claimed, the place where she kept her crown? The reality, of course, was far more mundane. Yet the very fact that such speculation existed shows how deeply the handbag had entered the cultural imagination. It was not just an accessory, it was an icon, and within the palace, it was part of a routine. Each day, attendants prepared outfits, jewelry, and accessories. The handbag was chosen, inspected, and handed to her. Yet, unlike other items, the handbag belonged to her directly. She carried it herself. She decided what to place inside. In a life where so much was orchestrated, this detail mattered. It was her daily assertion of independence. There is a lesson here about the nature of power. Sometimes it is not the grand gestures that matter most, but the small, consistent choices. The Queen's handbag, seemingly trivial, reflected her entire approach, restrained, steady, deliberate. It was never ostentatious, never flamboyant, but always reliable. So we are left to consider, what does it mean that a monarchy spanning decades, an institution tied to centuries of history, found one of its enduring symbols not in a crown or a scepter, but in a modest handbag? Does it suggest that power in the modern world is best expressed not through grandeur, but through familiarity, not through spectacle, but through the ordinary? When the public looks back on the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, Certain images will always stand out: the coronation with its heavy crown and long ermine robe, the balcony waves during jubilees, the brightly colored hats in crowded streets, and always, quietly but consistently, the handbag at her side. It is striking how this simple item endured for so many decades. While styles shifted, while the world around her transformed, the Queen's handbag remained virtually unchanged. She favored the same British company, Launer, for much of her life. The designs were understated, rectangular, structured, often with a small curved handle and polished clasp. They were not extravagant or overly decorative. They were practical, durable, and instantly recognizable. This repetition was not accidental. In a monarchy that thrives on ritual and continuity, the handbag reinforced a sense of permanence. Just as the crown jewels are kept not for fashion but for tradition, the handbag became part of her personal regalia, not official but symbolic all the same. It represented something steady, something unchanged in a restless world. Those who worked close to her understood the personal attachment she had to these objects. She was said to own dozens, if not hundreds, of nearly identical handbags. Yet the sameness was part of the point. She did not seek novelty. She sought reliability. Each handbag, though polished and replaced as needed, looked much like the last. This constancy reflected her broader philosophy. Monarchy was not about chasing trends. It was about embodying stability. There were also practical routines surrounding the handbag. Every day, attendance ensured it was ready. Every day, it accompanied her to formal ceremonies, 2 garden parties, 2 overseas visits, and 2 simple outings. It was rarely absent. Even when walking among her horses at Sandringham or Balmoral, the handbag was often visible. It became, almost unconsciously, part of her posture. Arm slightly bent, hand resting just so, the bag completing the silhouette. In this sense, the handbag was more than a possession. It was part of her identity. The Queen without her handbag would have looked incomplete, as if something essential were missing. This is perhaps why, in artistic depictions and cartoons, the handbag was so often included. Artists recognized that it was as much a symbol of her as the crown itself. As time went on, the handbag also became a cultural shorthand. When Paddington Bear tapped his own little case during the Jubilee sketch, and she tapped her handbag in reply, the gesture carried layers of meaning. It was playful, yes, but it was also deeply familiar to the public. Everyone knew what it meant to see the Queen with her handbag. It was a universal signifier. Beyond its image, though, the handbag also carried with it the weight of memory. Consider the decades it spanned, from the post-war years of the 1950s, through the social changes of the 1960s, the crises of the 1970s, the celebrations and controversies of the 1980s and 1990s, and into the new millennium. At every stage, the handbag was there. It appeared in black and white photographs, in colored television broadcasts, in digital images shared around the world. In each era, it looked the same. This created a kind of temporal bridge. The handbag linked generations, reminding people that though leaders changed, though technology advanced, the Queen endured. In her endurance, the handbag became an anchor, a quiet reassurance that history had a thread of continuity. There is another layer to consider: the personal. While the handbag was part of her public image, it was also her private possession. Inside it, she carried small items that grounded her in everyday life. A photograph of Prince Philip, a mirror and lipstick for quick touch-ups, a small handkerchief, sometimes a crossword puzzle. Nothing lavish, nothing secretive, simply the ordinary objects of daily existence. This detail is quietly powerful. For amid all the grandeur of monarchy, the handbag revealed that she too lived with small routines, small comforts, small practicalities. It reminded the public that she was both sovereign and person. The bag, therefore, served as a bridge between the extraordinary and the ordinary. As her reign entered its later decades, the handbag became more than a personal symbol. It became part of national memory. When people spotted her in crowds, they often looked first for the hat and then for the handbag. It became a reassurance, like a friend's familiar face. And when she passed in 2022, many tributes mentioned it specifically. Drawings, poems, and memorials depicted the handbag as a symbol of her presence. It was no longer simply leather and stitching. It was memory itself. In this way, the handbag teaches us something about history. Often we look to great events, to wars or revolutions, to speeches or treaties. Yet sometimes history resides in the small details, the objects carried quietly through daily life. A handbag, in its very ordinariness, can become an emblem of a reign. For Elizabeth II, the handbag embodied her approach to monarchy: quiet, consistent, understated, and enduring. It was never flashy. It was never the center of attention. Yet it was always there, just as she was always there. And in that quietness lay its strength. One might ask, will future monarchs have such symbols? Will they carry with them a daily object that, over time, becomes inseparable from their image? Or was the Queen's handbag unique, a product of her particular character, her long reign, and the cultural moment she occupied? The question remains open. What is certain is that her handbag, like her reign, will be remembered for generations. It will appear in museum displays, in documentaries, in the collective memory of the public. It will stand as proof that sometimes the smallest objects can carry the greatest meaning. And perhaps this is the final reflection, that power and legacy are not always measured by crowns, palaces, or grand declarations. Sometimes they are measured by the ordinary, carried faithfully until the ordinary itself becomes extraordinary. Story 3. The Queen's Gardens. Quiet labor, lasting beauty. When you think of Queen Elizabeth II, you may picture her at the trooping of the color, or sitting at her desk for the annual Christmas broadcast. Yet, if you look beyond the public images, another constant in her life emerges: her deep connection to gardens. Whether at Buckingham Palace, Windsor, Sandringham, or Balmoral, she was surrounded by carefully tended grounds, each with its own character and history. These gardens were not only places of beauty, they were also spaces of routine, labor, and quiet order. Let us step into one of them together. Imagine approaching the gates of Buckingham Palace on a warm summer morning. Behind the stone walls and iron railings, the gardens open up unexpectedly, stretching for nearly 40 acres. Few realize that in the very heart of London, hidden behind the palace, lies one of the largest private gardens in the city. There is a lake, sweeping lawns, a rose garden, and winding paths shaded by trees. This space was not simply ornamental. It was also functional. serving as a venue for royal garden parties where thousands of guests gathered each year. Yet, for most days, the garden was a quieter place. You might see gardeners in green uniforms, trimming hedges or tending flower beds. You might see the queen herself walking slowly along a path, her corgis trotting ahead. The air carried a mixture of city sounds, distant traffic, faint sirens, and the softer noises of birds, fountains, and leaves rustling in the wind. Gardens were part of her daily rhythm. They provided a contrast to the relentless schedule of meetings, ceremonies, and official duties. In the garden, time slowed. She could observe the changing of the seasons, the first buds of spring, the deep greens of summer, the golden leaves of autumn. She could watch swans on the lake or listen to the call of a blackbird. These details may seem small, but for someone whose life was filled with formality, they offered a kind of grounding. The queen's interest in gardens was not limited to enjoying their beauty. She understood the work behind them. She knew the gardeners by name and often spoke with them about the plants and the soil. At Balmoral, the Scottish estate, so closely tied to her personal life, she took particular pleasure in walking through the grounds, pointing out the trees planted by her parents or grandparents. For her, gardens carried memory. Each tree, each bed of flowers, was part of a living history, linking past and present. But to see the gardens only as places of leisure would be incomplete. They were also sites of labor, requiring daily care. The Buckingham Palace Gardens, for instance, employed a team of around 10 full-time gardeners, supported by seasonal workers. Their tasks were varied, mowing vast stretches of lawn, tending rare plants, repairing paths, clearing fallen branches after storms. The work was repetitive, steady, and often unnoticed. Yet, without it, the gardens would not have maintained their order. The gardeners themselves formed a quiet community within the palace. They began their days early, often before the palace came fully alive. They worked in all weather, under the hot sun, in the chill of rain, in the damp, gray mornings of London winters. They followed traditions of horticulture that stretched back centuries, using both modern tools and time-honored methods. And though their work was rarely publicized, it shaped the environment in which the monarchy moved. This balance between labor and leisure, between visible ceremony and hidden routine, defined the royal gardens. For visitors, the gardens were a backdrop to grand events. For the queen, they were places of solace and memory. For the gardeners, they were daily work, measured not in moments of spectacle, but in hours of trimming, planting, and waiting for growth. It is easy to overlook such details. History often remembers battles, treaties, and speeches. Yet, the gardens remind us that history is also lived in quiet spaces, in the tending of plants, in the steady rhythms of the natural world. For Elizabeth II, whose life was otherwise filled with noise and expectation, the gardens offered a rare form of stillness. And so one wonders, did the gardens shape her as much as she shaped them? Did the constancy of growing things, slow, steady, patient, reinforce her own sense of endurance? Did she see in the turning of seasons a reflection of her reign, with its own cycles of change and continuity? Story 3. The Queen's Gardens. Quiet labor. Lasting beauty. If the private walks and quiet moments in the gardens gave Queen Elizabeth II peace, the grand gatherings within those same grounds revealed another side of their purpose. Every summer, Buckingham Palace hosted several garden parties, each bringing together thousands of guests from across Britain and the Commonwealth. Teachers, veterans, volunteers, community leaders, and local heroes walked the same lawns where the Queen herself once strolled alone with her dogs. The scale of these gatherings was immense. Imagine the sight: more than 8,000 guests dressed in formal attire, women in hats of every color, men in dark suits, scattered across the sweeping lawns. Marquees were erected, tables laden with sandwiches, cakes, and the famous cups of tea poured endlessly by staff. The band of the household division played softly in the background, their brass notes carrying across the lake at the center of it all. The Queen moved slowly among the guests, her bright outfit visible even at a distance. The handbag, of course, was at her side. Her presence transformed the event from a picnic into a ritual of national recognition. Too many guests, the invitation to a garden party was a once-in-a-lifetime honor. It was a symbol that their quiet work, teaching in a village school, volunteering in a local charity, serving in the armed forces, had been noticed by the crown. Yet, behind the glamour and ceremony lay the steady work of preparation. The palace gardeners spent weeks ensuring that the grounds were perfect. Lawns had to be trimmed evenly, flower beds refreshed with seasonal blooms, gravel paths raked smooth. The lake was cleared of debris, fountains checked, and shrubs pruned. Even the trees were inspected to make sure no dead branches posed a hazard. Every detail mattered, because the garden itself was as much on display as the monarch. The catering staff, too, undertook monumental tasks. Thousands of finger sandwiches were prepared: cucumber, smoked salmon, egg, and cress. Cakes of every kind were baked, from sponge squares dusted with sugar to fruit tarts topped with glistening berries. The sheer volume of food required military-style organization. Teams of chefs, bakers, and servers coordinated their efforts so that by the time guests arrived, everything flowed smoothly. From the Queen's perspective, these events were both duty and pleasure. She was known for her stamina, moving through long lines of guests, offering small conversations, smiles, and handshakes. Her words were brief but carefully chosen. To each guest, a few seconds of her attention carried significance. And always, in the background, the garden framed the encounter: green lawns underfoot, flowers in bloom, the palace rising beyond. But when the parties ended and the guests departed, the gardens returned to their quieter rhythm. The seasonal cycle resumed. Winter brought stark branches, frosted lawns, and the quiet work of pruning. Spring brought planting, bulbs pushing through soil, and bursts of color. Summer brought fullness and fragrance, while autumn carried falling leaves, the scent of damp earth, and preparations for dormancy. The Queen, moving between residences, experienced each garden in its season. At Windsor, the Long Walk and the Home Park stretched wide, dotted with ancient oaks and deer grazing in the distance. At Sandringham, the gardens had a more informal character, with woodlands and walled plots where fruit and vegetables were grown. At Balmoral, the Scottish Highland air gave the grounds a rugged beauty: heather, pine, and the fast-running waters of the River Dee. Each estate reflected not only the land, but also the traditions of those who worked it. Generations of gardeners, foresters, and groundskeepers shaped these spaces. Their work was invisible to most, yet essential. A rose garden does not bloom by accident. A lawn does not maintain itself. Each display of beauty required hours of labor, weeding, watering, planting, trimming, and careful observation. The queen valued this work. She often spoke to the gardeners, asking after particular plants or trees. She noticed changes, remembered details, and sometimes gave instructions. She was not merely a passive viewer. Her knowledge of plants, inherited in part from her parents and her lifelong experience, allowed her to engage with the gardens actively. In this way, the gardens became not just a backdrop, but a dialogue between nature, labor, and tradition. From the outside, these details may seem ordinary, even dull. Yet they reveal something profound. The monarchy, often seen as distant and ceremonial, was also rooted in the soil. Its continuity was not only measured in crowns and ceremonies, but also in the tending of grounds, the marking of seasons, the steady rhythm of growth and decay. Perhaps this is why the queen found such comfort in gardens. They mirrored her own role, constant, patient, enduring. Just as a gardener shapes but does not control the growth of plants, so too did she guide but not dictate the course of history. She embodied stability while the world around her shifted. And so we return to the question, what do gardens reveal about power? Are they simply ornamental, or do they reflect something deeper, a philosophy of order, patience, and continuity that shaped not only the land but the reign itself? To understand the significance of Queen Elizabeth II's gardens, one must look not only at the flowers and lawns, but also at the layers of memory they held. Gardens are living archives. Unlike books, they are not fixed. They grow, fade, and renew. Yet, in their cycles, they preserve a history of choices, of seasons past, and of hands that shaped them. For the queen, whose reign spanned 70 years, the gardens became markers of time, both personal and national. At Balmoral, trees were planted to commemorate births, marriages, and jubilees. Each trunk rising from the soil carried with it a story. Walking through the estate, the queen could trace her family history, not through portraits on walls, but through the living map of the grounds. She might pass a tree planted by her father, George VI, or one placed by her children or grandchildren. In these quiet acts of planting, continuity was inscribed into the very soil. The queen also drew meaning from the seasonal cycles she observed year after year. At Sandringham, snowdrops pushed through the earth each January, heralding a new year. At Windsor, daffodils spread across the meadows each spring. At Buckingham Palace, roses flourished in the summer sun. These rhythms were steady, dependable. They reminded her and those who lived and worked in the palaces that history moved not only in dramatic events, but also in the slow unfolding of seasons. For many in Britain, the royal gardens became symbols of endurance. Images of the Queen walking among flowers at Chelsea Flower Show, or greeting guests amid blooming roses, were broadcast to the public. Even those who never stepped inside the palace grounds could imagine the constancy of these gardens year after year. In moments of national uncertainty, economic hardship, political disputes, or global crises, the sight of the Queen amid orderly gardens offered reassurance. Life continued. The seasons turned, yet gardens also carried sorrow. When Prince Philip died in 2021, the Queen found solace in walking the grounds of Windsor. Reports spoke of her taking solitary walks, accompanied only by her dogs. The familiar trees and paths became companions in grief. Gardens, with their balance of growth and decay, offered perspective. Just as flowers bloom and fade, so too do lives. In this sense, the gardens taught lessons of acceptance, quiet, unspoken, but deeply felt. The work of the gardeners carried on through all of this. They were custodians, not only of plants, but of memory. Their hands shaped the landscapes that framed royal life, from weddings to funerals, from jubilees to private walks. Many gardeners served for decades, their own lives intertwined with the Queen's. In interviews, some spoke of the pride they felt in tending the grounds for her, not for fame, but for continuity. Their labor ensured that the gardens remained places of solace, ceremony, and symbolism. Looking back, the Queen's devotion to gardens also reflects something broader about her reign. She was not a monarch of sudden change or flamboyant gestures. She was steady, measured, and constant. Gardens suited her temperament. They required patience, resilience, and faith in long-term outcomes. Planting a tree is not about immediate results. It is about the future. So too was her vision of monarchy, not for one moment, but for generations. When she passed in 2022, tributes poured in not only to her public service, but also to her private constancies. Among them, the gardens were remembered. Images circulated of Balmoral's heather-covered hills, of Sandringham's parkland, of Windsor's sweeping avenues. These places had framed her life. They were not simply backdrops. They were participants in history today. As visitors walk the public paths of Windsor or glimpse the grounds of Buckingham Palace during rare openings, they step into landscapes shaped by her choices and by the countless hours of quiet labor performed in her name. The flowers, the trees, the lawns, all carry echoes of her reign. They are reminders that history is not only preserved in monuments and documents, but also in soil, roots, and leaves. In reflecting on the Queen's gardens, we are reminded of a larger truth, that the ordinary can become extraordinary when sustained across time. A garden, like a reign, is built not in a day, but in decades of care. And just as the Queen's steady presence shaped Britain's modern history, so too did her gardens embody endurance, patience, and quiet beauty. So perhaps the final question is this: when future generations walk among the trees she planted, or rest their eyes on the lawns she once crossed, will they feel her presence not only as a monarch, but as a gardener of memory? Story 4. Royal Horses, a lifelong companionship from the earliest days of her childhood. Queen Elizabeth II was surrounded by horses. They were not only creatures of beauty, but companions, teachers, and, in many ways, mirrors of her own character. To understand her lifelong relationship with horses is to glimpse a part of her that remains steady from beginning to end, private yet public, personal yet national. As a young princess in the 1930s, Elizabeth was introduced to ponies before she could properly spell the word. Her very first pony, a Shetland named Peggy, was gifted to her when she was just 4 years old. Peggy was small but sturdy, a fitting companion for a child who already displayed patience and a quiet determination. Riding lessons began early, often on the grounds of Windsor, where paths, fields, and meadows provided a safe but challenging environment. From the start, Elizabeth was known for her calmness in the saddle. Unlike some children who are restless or easily distracted, she focused intently on the animal beneath her. Horses demand consistency, and she provided it. She learned how to balance, how to guide without force, how to respect the will of the animal while also maintaining control. These early lessons, though ordinary in appearance, formed the foundation of a lifelong bond. By the time she was a teenager, riding had become second nature. While the world around her was shifting, war breaking out in 1939, air raids over London, the royal family adapting to rationing and uncertainty, the stables remained a place of routine. The smell of hay, the clatter of hooves, the daily rhythm of feeding and grooming provided stability. Even during wartime, horses had to be cared for, and Elizabeth took that responsibility seriously. Observers at the time noted her natural affinity with the animals. She was not a showy rider. She did not ride to impress. She rode because it was part of who she was. Her posture was straight, her hands steady, her presence calm. Horses, sensitive to human moods, responded to her quiet confidence. In this mutual trust, a bond was forged. As she grew older, her equestrian interests expanded. She became fascinated not only with riding, but with the breeding and training of horses. By her late teens, she could discuss bloodlines, training methods, and the finer points of conformation with surprising expertise. This was not a hobby pursued casually, but with seriousness and care. Horses were woven into her daily life. The connection endured when she ascended to the throne in 2009-52 in the midst of constitutional duties, international diplomacy, and public appearances. Horses remained a personal refuge. Riding allowed her a rare sense of freedom. On horseback, she could move without ceremony, unaccompanied by fanfare, guided only by the rhythm of hooves and the sway of movement. Balmoral and Sandringham, she was often seen riding in the early mornings or late afternoons. These rides were not staged for cameras, though photographs occasionally captured them. They were personal rituals. Even into her later years, she continued to ride, adjusting from tall horses to smaller ponies as age demanded, but never relinquishing the habit altogether. This early and enduring companionship with horses shaped her character in ways subtle yet profound. Horses teach patience, resilience, and humility. They require care every day, regardless of weather or circumstance. They remind their riders that control is always partial, that partnership, not domination, is the path to success. For a monarch whose reign demanded constancy and balance, these lessons were invaluable. And so we might pause here at the image of a young princess on her pony Peggy, the first of many rides in a life that would stretch across nearly a century. Could it be that in those early rides, the foundations of her reign were already being laid? If her early ponies taught Elizabeth patience and steadiness, it was in the world of thoroughbreds that her passion for horses truly blossomed. Horse racing, long called the sport of kings, unlike many who approach it as a pastime or a pursuit of glamour, the Queen engaged with it as a student, a breeder, and, ultimately, a master of the craft. Her involvement began even before she inherited the throne. King George VI, her father, was a keen supporter of racing, and Elizabeth absorbed his enthusiasm. After his death in 1952, the young queen inherited not only the crown, but also his stables at Sandringham. These became the foundation of her own breeding and racing operation. What began as an inheritance soon grew into a serious and respected enterprise, built on her own choices, her own eye for horses, and her own enduring commitment. From the outset, she immersed herself in the details. She studied bloodlines with the same precision she applied to state documents. Pedigrees, strengths, temperaments, distances. She could discuss them fluently with trainers, jockeys, and breeders. Those who worked with her often remarked on her extraordinary memory for horses. She could recall details about foals born decades earlier, or the results of a particular race from years gone by. With striking accuracy, her success as an owner was no mere ceremonial indulgence. Over the course of her reign, she bred and raced more than 1,600 winners. Her horses triumphed at prestigious meetings: Ascot, Epsom, Goodwood, Doncaster. In 1954 and 1957, she was Britain's leading flat race owner, a remarkable achievement for anyone, let alone a reigning monarch. Each victory was the product of years of planning, the careful matching of stallions and mares, the patient training of young horses, the steady hand of management. Her most famous victories became part of racing folklore. One of her proudest moments came in 1954, when her horse, Oriole, a chestnut stallion, won the Coronation Cup. The symbolism was irresistible: a coronation of a queen and a triumph at the Coronation Cup. Another high point was in 1977, her Silver Jubilee year, when her horse Dunfermline won both the Oaks at Epsom and the St. Leger at Doncaster. Those victories felt doubly symbolic, as if her public Jubilee celebrations had found an echo in the thunder of hooves on turf. Yet her relationship with racing was not only about winning. Losses were frequent, as they are for anyone in the sport, but the Queen accepted them with grace. Racing, after all, is unpredictable, a mixture of breeding, training, weather, and chance. Her consistency in the face of disappointment reflected her broader outlook on life. Steady, uncomplaining, and resilient at Royal Ascot, perhaps the most famous meeting of the racing year, she was not merely a guest of honor, but a participant. Each June, she arrived in her carriage, greeted by cheers and applause, but her attention was not on the pageantry alone. She studied the horses with a sharp eye, conversed with trainers and jockeys, and followed the races with keen interest. The festival was both a social occasion and a professional one. Those close to her often said that horses brought out a rare informality in her. In the stables, among trainers and grooms, she could speak plainly, without the constraints of ceremonial language. Horses did not care for crowns or titles. They responded only to tone, touch, and care. In their company, she was not a monarch, but a fellow rider, a fellow student, a fellow enthusiast. This duality, sovereign and horsewoman, ran throughout her life. The racetrack and the paddock offered her a sphere where she could exercise authority of a different kind. Here, her decisions were guided not by constitutional precedent, but by instinct and knowledge. Here, results were measured not in political outcomes, but in the length of a stride, the dip of a head, the flash of a finish line. For the Queen, horses were not a distraction from duty, but an extension of it. They provided discipline, continuity, and the satisfaction of watching years of patient work culminate. They also connected her to the broader public, for horse racing in Britain is not confined to palaces. It is a national sport, woven into village life, local economies, and working-class traditions as much as aristocratic ones. Through racing, she bridged worlds, the royal box and the bookmaker's stands, the paddock and the public park. And in doing so, she reminded her subjects that, despite the gulf between monarch and citizen, there were passions that could unite them all in the rhythm of galloping hooves and the anticipation of a photo finish. As Elizabeth moved into the later decades of her reign, her bond with horses deepened rather than diminished. While age gradually limited her ability to ride in the spirited way she had as a girl, it did not weaken her interest, nor her daily engagement with the animals that had been her lifelong companions. In fact, horses seemed to take on an even greater role in her routine, a source of continuity as governments changed, children grew older, and the world beyond the palace walls shifted in ways both subtle and dramatic. Her mornings often began with reports from her trainers. The documents that crossed her desk at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle included not only matters of state, but also updates on foals, mares in foal, training schedules, and the condition of particular thoroughbreds. She read these attentively, sometimes with more visible enthusiasm than the weightier matters of diplomacy or domestic policy. To some, it might have seemed trivial, but to her it was simply another kind of responsibility, one that demanded the same consistency she applied to governance. Horses remained a part of her physical routine, too. Well, into her 80s and even her 90s, she continued to ride. Photographs from those years show her in a headscarf, often on her beloved ponies, taking rides around Windsor Great Park. These were not the fast gallops of youth, but gentle rides, steady and measured. The sight of the Queen on horseback, upright in the saddle despite her age, became a kind of living emblem of her resilience. She did not ride for show, but for the quiet pleasure of movement, of companionship, of being outdoors in a way that was both dignified and ordinary, beyond the act of riding. She found comfort in the presence of the animals themselves. Horses, with their sensitivity and their quiet strength, provided companionship of a kind different from that offered by people. They did not demand, they did not flatter, they did not expect speeches or ceremonies. They responded instead to tone and touch, and they mirrored the calm or the tension of those around them. In their presence, Elizabeth could set aside the roles of queen, mother, and figurehead, and simply exist as a woman who loved horses. Her later years also saw her pass this passion along to younger generations. Children and grandchildren were introduced to ponies at an early age, echoing her own childhood. Princess Anne, her daughter, became a skilled equestrian in her own right, competing at the Olympics. Zara Tyndall, Anne's daughter, carried that legacy forward with international competition. The tradition of horse riding was thus not only personal, but familial, a thread woven through generations of the royal household at the same time. Her public association with horses remained a visible and enduring symbol of her reign, trooping the color. State visits, jubilees, again and again, horses were part of the ceremonial life that surrounded her. The household cavalry, their mounts gleaming and disciplined, performed with precision that reflected her own standards. Crowds might have come to see pageantry, but to Elizabeth, these were not mere displays. They were affirmations of continuity, traditions upheld through care, patience, and years of training qualities she knew well from her own experience with horses. Even in her private retreats, horses anchored her. At Balmoral, at Windsor, at Sandringham stables and paddocks were as familiar as drawing rooms. The routines of feeding, grooming, exercising, and breeding carried on regardless of political upheavals, scandals, or international crises. Horses lived by their own schedules, and their rhythms lent stability to her own. Her attachment was not sentimental in a shallow sense. She was pragmatic about animals, recognizing their limits, their needs, and sometimes their failings. She knew when to retire a horse, when to breed, when to sell, when to let go. Yet, beneath the pragmatism was a deep respect, even reverence. Horses had given her companionship, success, solace, and continuity. They had carried her in childhood, in adulthood, in widowhood, and in the twilight years of her reign, in the final seasons of her life. Images of her with her ponies became emblematic of her endurance. When public appearances became fewer, photographs of her in Windsor Great Park, reins in hand, conveyed both her frailty and her persistence. She was not racing anymore, not riding long distances, but still present, still connected to the creatures that had shaped her days when she passed in 2022. The tributes often mentioned her horses. Trainers, jockeys, grooms, and fellow enthusiasts recalled her knowledge, her passion, her quiet humor about the unpredictability of racing. For them, she had not been an untouchable monarch, but a fellow horsewoman who understood the quirks of a nervous foal or the joy of a clean jump. At her funeral, two of her favorite ponies, Carlton Lima, Emma, and fell pony Sandy, stood quietly as the procession passed, a reminder, simple and moving, of the companions that had defined her private world. The relationship between Queen Elizabeth II and her horses was, in the end, not just a personal preference, but a defining aspect of her reign. Through them, she found discipline, continuity, and solace. Through them, she bridged tradition and modernity, royalty and common life. Horses were not an accessory to her story, but a constant thread. From the ponies of her childhood to the companions of her final years. And so one may ask, was it the Queen who shaped her horses? Or was it, in some quiet way, the horses who shaped the Queen? Story 5. Parchment from skin. The quiet labor of medieval page-making. When you picture a medieval manuscript, your eyes might be drawn to the decorated letters, the gold leaf shining against dark ink, or the saints and beasts painted in vivid color. But before those embellishments, before even the first line of text was inscribed, there was a surface, the page itself. That surface was parchment, and parchment began not in a scriptorium, but in a field, in the quiet work of raising animals whose skins would one day hold the written memory of an age taught. To understand the making of parchment, you must begin with sheep, goats, and calves. These animals provided more than wool, milk, or meat. Their hides, once treated with extraordinary patience, became the foundation of Europe's written culture. Without parchment, the great works of theology, law, and poetry would not have been preserved. The animals grazing in pastures were, unknowingly, future custodians of civilization's words. The process began with selection. Not every skin was suitable for parchment. Hides had to be free from scars, cuts, or insect bites that would mar a writing surface. Calfskins were especially prized, for their smoothness and even texture. Goat and sheepskins were more common, often more affordable, and found their way into a great many books, from humble account rolls to scholastic texts. Each type of skin had its own qualities. Calfskin vellum was smooth and resilient, sheepskin softer and whiter, goatskin firmer, but often with more blemishes. The preparation of parchment was a craft unto itself, and parchmenters were respected for their skill. First, the skins had to be cleaned. They were soaked in water, sometimes mixed with lime, to loosen hair and flesh. The process could take days, depending on the thickness of the hide. During this time, the skins swelled, the hair loosened, and the outer layers softened. The smell was not pleasant. Workshops often stood outside town centers, where the air was less crowded and complaints fewer. Once ready, the skin was stretched over a wooden frame called a hearse. Pegs or cords held it taut, and the work of scraping began. With a curved knife, the parchmenter removed the last remnants of hair and flesh, shaving the surface until it was thin, even, and smooth. Each movement of the knife was measured. Too little pressure, and the residue remained. Too much, and the blade cut through. The sound of scraping, a dry rasping, echoed in the yard, joined perhaps by the bleating of animals in nearby fields or the clatter of town life beyond. The skin, stretched and scraped, dried on the frame. As it dried, it tightened, becoming smooth and firm. But the parchmenter's work was far from finished. He dusted the surface with chalk or pumice, rubbing it down to whiten it and provide texture for ink. He tested the stretch, checked for holes, adjusted the pegs, and smoothed again. Hours became days, days became weeks. What emerged was not yet a book, but the possibility of one, a clean, pale surface, waiting for words. The choice of skins mattered deeply. Monasteries and universities often ordered large quantities, sometimes specifying calf or sheep according to the importance of the text. A Bible might demand fine vellum. A rental contract could rest on sheepskin. This hierarchy of material reflected the hierarchy of ideas. Sacred words deserved the smoothest, most resilient pages, yet even humble parchment held weight. Think of a village account, noting rents paid in grain or labor. Those words, scratched on sheepskin, recorded obligations that shaped the daily lives of peasants and lords alike. They carried authority because parchment endured. Papyrus crumbled paper in its early European use tour, but parchment could last centuries. What was written upon it became part of a long memory. There is, in this craft, a tension between life and death, between animal and text. The skin of a calf becomes the vessel for psalms. The hide of a sheep, stretched and scraped, bears the ink of a charter binding lords and tenants. Flesh becomes memory, body becomes text. It is a transformation, both practical and symbolic, a quiet labor that underpinned the very structure of medieval society. And so, when you next imagine a monk bending over a manuscript, quill in hand, imagine also the fields beyond the cloister, the hearse in the parchmenter's yard, the rasp of the knife across skin. For without those sounds, without that labor, there would be no page for ink to flow across, no words to carry forward through centuries. But parchment, once prepared, was not yet a book. The sheets had to be cut, arranged, sewn, and bound. And before that, they awaited the hand of the scribe, who would transform them from pale silence into living words. What did it mean for those scribes to write on a surface that carried such effort, such transformation, such quiet endurance? If the parchmenter transformed rawhide into a pale sheet, it was the scribe who gave that sheet a voice. The blank skin, smooth and stretched, carried a kind of silence. Only with ink, quill, and patience would it begin to speak. To imagine the medieval scribe at work, you must picture not a hurried writer, but a craftsman trained to transform silence into permanence. The scribe's day began in quiet serenity. In a monastery, the scriptorium was a room of long wooden desks, angled for writing. Light filtered through narrow windows, and silence was enforced. Voices could distract, mistakes could creep into sacred texts, and parchment was too valuable to waste. Each page represented hours of animal husbandry, soaking, scraping, and smoothing. To blot, to misspell, to miscopy was not only a personal failing, but a waste of collective labor. The tools of the scribe were simple but demanding. A quill cut from a goose feather was shaped with a small knife to achieve a sharp, steady point. Ink, usually made from oak galls mixed with iron salts, clung darkly to the page. Sometimes it shimmered when first applied, turning brown with age. Rulers and dividers helped mark lines across the parchment, ensuring neatness. Without them, words could slope, text could crowd, and a page could descend into disorder. Before writing began, the scribe often pricked tiny holes along the edge of the sheet with a knife or compass point. These pricks guided the ruling faint lines drawn with a stylus across the page. The result was a grid, invisible once filled with words, but essential for maintaining harmony. To look at a medieval manuscript today is to see beauty, but beneath that beauty was structure, invisible scaffolding that guided the hand. Once prepared, the act of writing began. The scribe dipped the quill, drew it across the parchment, lifted it, dipped again. Each letter required precision. Gothic script, with its dense, angular strokes, demanded careful control. Caroline, minuscule, more rounded and open, allowed swifter motion. Whatever the style, consistency was key. A single wavering line could jar the eye. Readers expected not only accuracy of content, but harmony of form. Copying was not invention. The scribe worked from an exemplar, an existing manuscript, placed beside or above the blank sheet. Line by line, word by word, he transferred text. Sometimes two scribes worked together, one reading aloud, the other writing. This method reduced eye strain, but introduced its own risks: misheard words, skipped phrases. Silent copying minimized those errors, but the monotony could weary the eyes, blur the letters, tempt the hand to wander. Errors did happen. Some were caught and corrected, scraped away with a knife, replaced with the right word. Others slipped through, preserved forever in ink. Margins sometimes held notes, explanations, or quiet jokes. A scribe, weary of long hours, might leave a comment. The parchment is thin. The ink is bad. The day is long. These notes, hidden in margins, remind us that the makers of books were human, not anonymous machines. For sacred texts, the responsibility was heavier still. To copy scripture was to handle not merely words, but the word. Accuracy was paramount. Monasteries developed checks, One monk copied, another proofread, a third compared against the exemplar. Errors could not be tolerated, for they risked altering doctrine. And yet, despite vigilance, variations crept in, multiplying across centuries. Entire schools of textual study today are devoted to tracing these divergences. Born of weary hands in dim scriptoria beyond words, some scribes prepared for illumination, spaces left blank where artists would later paint images, initials, or decorations. To set aside those spaces required foresight. Text and image had to fit together, not crowd one another. The scribe's awareness of the page as a whole was constant. Each sheet was more than words. It was a composition, a balance between silence and sound, image and text. One must not imagine all scribes as monks. By the later Middle Ages, professional scribes in towns produced charters, contracts, legal texts, and books for universities. In Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and other centers of learning, secular scribes filled orders for students and scholars. The rhythm of their days echoed that of their monastic counterparts, quill, ink, page, line after line. Their labor, though, was often more commercial, part of a growing book trade. The endurance required was remarkable. Hours bent over a desk, eyes straining in low light, fingers stained with ink. Cold in winter, heat in summer. The work continued. Hands cramped, backs ached, yet the words accumulated. Slowly, sheet by sheet, the silence of parchment yielded to the murmur of text. The result was not merely a page, but permanence. Each finished leaf carried the weight of weeks, months, or even years of labor. And once bound into a book, it could outlast kingdoms, carry ideas across centuries, preserve knowledge through wars, plagues, and reformations. Still, as each page filled, a question hovered. What came next? For the words were not enough. The book needed form, protection, and binding. Parchment and script must be gathered, sewn, and covered. Only then could it truly be called a book. How did parchment, stitched and bound, become not just a page, but an object, a codex, carried from hand to hand, shelf to shelf, century to century? When the parchment had been prepared and the scribes had filled it with text, the work was not yet complete. Loose sheets of writing, no matter how carefully produced, were vulnerable. They could be misplaced, torn, or damaged. To become a book, a manuscript required another stage of labor, the craft of binding. This process transformed separate leaves into a unified object, one that could be carried, opened, and preserved. It was, in many ways, the final act in the quiet chain of work that stretched from pasture to page. The making of a codex, the bound form of the book, began with gatherings. Sheets of parchment, cut and folded, were grouped into quires. A single large sheet, folded once, made to leaves for pages. Folded again, it made for leaves 8 pages. By combining these folded sheets, scribes and binders created gatherings that could be stacked and sewn together. Each quire had to be carefully arranged so that the text flowed correctly, page to page, without confusion. To guide the process, scribes often added catchwords, small notes at the bottom of a page that predicted the first word of the next quire. These tiny anchors helped keep the book's order secure. Once arranged, the gatherings were sewn. Thick thread, often linen, passed through the folds, binding each quire to its neighbor. Wooden boards, cut to size, served as covers. The boards were pierced, the threads drawn through and tied off. Gradually, a solid spine took shape. This structure, plain and strong, turned fragile sheets into a durable whole over the spine. Binders often stretched leather, calf, sheep, or goat, dyed, polished, and sometimes tooled with decoration. The leather protected the parchment within from dust, damp, and handling. Clasps or straps, usually of leather and metal, kept the covers tight. Parchment had a tendency to warp with humidity, curling outward. Clasps held the book firm, preserving its rectangular shape. To open such a volume was to release a small tension, the sound of clasps unhooking and covers yielding. Decoration varied widely. A humble village account book might be bound in plain leather, rough but functional. A Bible for a cathedral could be gilded, its cover inlaid with jewels, ivory panels, or embossed patterns. The binding reflected not only the value of the text, but also the status of its owner. Yet, whether simple or sumptuous, all bindings shared a purpose: to protect words and give them form. The codex offered more than durability. Its structure made reading more practical. Scrolls had required laborious unrolling. Codices opened directly to a desired passage. Pages could be turned quickly, references checked, comparisons made. In monasteries and universities, where scholars needed to consult multiple texts, the codex was invaluable. The format itself, parchment, folded, sewn, and bound, shaped the very way people thought about reading and study. Bookbinders, like parchmenters and scribes, worked largely in the background. Their names seldom appeared in colophons or records. Yet their labor was crucial. Without sturdy binding, the work of parchmenters and scribes would not endure. The codex, strong and portable, allowed medieval books to survive centuries of use, travel, and storage. Many volumes produced in the 12th or 13th centuries remain intact today, their bindings worn but functional, their parchment pages legible still. The finished book was not only a vessel of durability, but also a bearer of presence. Imagine a medieval reader lifting such a volume, its weight pressed into the hands, its clasp snapped open, its pages, thick and cool, turned slowly. To read was to engage with an object that carried the labor of fields, workshops, and each codex embodied the work of countless hands, most of them unremembered. Some manuscripts became cherished heirlooms, passed from one generation of monastic libraries to another, catalogued, read, and read again. Others served practical purposes, recording rents, listing names, tracking debts. In both sacred and mundane contexts, the codex made memory portable, durable, and authoritative. To possess a book was to possess permanence, and permanence was power. Yet, we might ask, in an age when few could read, why invest so much effort in these objects? Part of the answer lies in authority. A text on parchment bore weight. It was official, lasting, less easily altered. A charter written on sheepskin could settle disputes long after the witnesses were gone. A psalter copied on vellum could guide prayer for generations. The codex, with its solid form, embodied continuity. When we look at medieval books today, in libraries or museums, we see more than ink on skin. we see the echoes of fields where sheep once grazed, of workshops where skins were stretched, of scriptoria where monks bent over quills, of binders' benches where leather was pulled tight over wooden boards. We see the long chain of quiet labor that turned flesh into word, hide into memory, silence into voice, and in that transformation lies a profound reflection, the very survival of medieval thought. Law and faith rests on the unnoticed work of those who scraped, stitched, and sewed. Without them, parchment would have remained blank, and history itself might have faded away. So we end this story where it began, with a simple question. When you hold a book, are you holding only words? Or are you also holding the quiet labor of centuries? Story 6. Gardens, fountains, and the silent work of Ottoman gardeners when you approached an Ottoman palace, mosque, or madrasa in the 16th or 17th century. You did not simply step from the dust of the street into the grandeur of domes and courtyards. First, you passed through a garden. These gardens were not wild spaces, nor were they dense forests. They were carefully arranged, measured in their proportions, and filled with the sound of trickling water. To enter them was to step into an ordered world, one that reflected ideals of harmony, discipline, and divine beauty. The Ottomans inherited gardening traditions from earlier. The idea of the Chahor Bagh, the four-part garden divided by water channels, was of Persian origin. Their gardens were often more open, designed to frame the soaring forms of mosques and palaces rather than to enclose a private paradise. Yet the principle of order remained: paths straight, trees aligned, fountains centered. At the heart of these spaces stood water. In an Ottoman garden, the eye was led not only by greenery, but by the sparkle and movement of fountains, pools, and channels. The empire's engineers were skilled in channeling water, bringing it into cities through aqueducts and cisterns, and distributing it into courtyards and gardens. A single fountain might cool the air, soften the sounds of the city, and remind the visitor of the Quranic image of paradise. Gardens beneath which rivers flow. The work of creating and maintaining these spaces fell to gardeners, pastimes. Their title derived from the Turkish word bostan, meaning vegetable garden, but their duties extended far beyond food cultivation. The pastimes tended the palace gardens, planted trees along avenues. They were both laborers and guards, for the Bostank Corps also served as a military unit, responsible for protecting the Sultan's private grounds and, at times, for carrying out his punishments day by day. Their tasks were quiet but exacting. They pruned roses so they would bloom in measured order, swept gravel paths, repaired fountains, and aligned plantings to preserve the symmetry that pleased both eye and spirit. Their work was never complete, for gardens are living things, always growing, always shifting. A trimmed hedge would soon require trimming again. A fountain cleaned of algae would need cleaning again. The garden existed not as a finished work, but as an ongoing process of care. These Ottoman gardens were not only places of beauty, but also of sustenance. Fruit trees, especially pomegranates, apricots, figs, and mulberries, stood beside ornamentals. Herbs and vegetables filled neat beds. The sultans and their households dined on food grown within palace grounds. This combination of utility and beauty reflected a philosophy of balance. Gardens should nourish. Imagine stepping out of the crowded streets of Istanbul into the outer courts of Topkapi Palace. The city's noise would fade, replaced by birdsong and the whisper of leaves. Marble basins caught the sunlight. Cypress trees stood tall and slender, casting narrow shadows across lawns. The air was cooler, scented with roses and orange blossoms. It was not only a change of scenery, but a change of state, from bustle to order, from heat to shade, from chaos to rhythm. But behind this tranquility was work steady, repetitive, often invisible. The bowstanks labored before dawn, weeding, trimming, hauling water, and repairing channels. Their footprints were erased by their own sweeping. Their hands left little trace on the blossoms they coaxed into order. The beauty visitors admired was the product of hours of unglamorous. A neglected garden would signal decline. A flourishing one suggested prosperity and stability. Thus, the quiet gardeners, anonymous in their labor, contributed in their own way to the image of the empire. And yet, as you pass through the garden gate in imagination, you might pause to ask, who were these men, working in silence beneath cypress and fountain? And how did their daily routines sustain both beauty and power? You've been listening to boring pastimes, gentle stories from history, told slowly and quietly, so that the past may keep you company as you rest. Thank you for drifting through time with us. Until next time, may your sleep be calm and your dreams quietly historical.